These photos cover a lifetime of enjoyment and inspiration in the mountains, as remembered in August 2002. Climbing various sorts of mountains in various parts of the world has always been an important part of my life. In 1980, I became the first woman to reach the highest point in all 50 states, a 40-plus year project, and for 11 years I was the only woman. Beautiful scenery, strong friendships, our lives often depend on each other. Overcoming difficult terrain and the thrill of reaching a goal can make it quite exhilarating. Years ago, climbing was much more casual than now. We tied a climbing rope around the waist, carried a trusty ice axe and crampons in a pack with extra clothes, and set out. Nowadays, one wears a hard hat, is tied into a complex harness, carries plenty of metal gadgets, often clips into a fixed rope and climbs that rather than the peak, gets in trouble, pulls out a cell phone to call for a helicopter rescue. We had none of that. We were on our own. Mount Shikarawa is in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. My parents enjoyed climbing mountains and started me at an early age on mountains like Shikarawa. This is another view of Mount Shikarawa. I've climbed it several times since. This is Squam Lake in New Hampshire, later known as Golden Pond. We had a summer place there, and I spent many summers there, starting as a small child. This is my family, taken about the time my sister and I were in college. My father was Roland Chamberlin on the left. He was a geology professor at the University of Chicago. And my mother, Dorothy Chamberlin, and my sister, Louise. And I'm on the right. That's Mount Adams, the second highest peak in New Hampshire. This was taken after an early October snowstorm. This is another shot of Mount Adams, the second highest peak in New Hampshire. The autumn color along the Tuckerman Ravine Trail going up Mount Washington. My father took me up this trail when I was 11. We came down the other side, the Ammonoosuc Trail. Mount Washington from the south with quite a lot of snow on it. I've climbed Mount Washington in various directions, various times. Along the Blue Ridge Parkway in Virginia, the peaks of Otter. This otter is called Sharp Top. Tryon, North Carolina, where I lived for 14 years. The Tryon Trail Trotters regularly went up Hogback and Rocky Spur. Now there's a new Palmetto Trail, runs from the mountains to the sea, goes over the top of Hogback. Charlie's Bunyan in the Smokies. The Appalachian Trail goes past here. A scene in the mountains of North Carolina, typical mountain scenery. When I was 13, we first came west as a family and we visited the Tetons in Wyoming. My father took me up the Grand Teton and it all seemed quite thrilling. The cathedral group of the Tetons with my husband Dave on the bridge. Tiwanaut, the Grand Teton, and Mount Owen. The same peaks taken from the top of Storm Point. A full day's hike up Cascade Canyon brings you to Lake Solitude, which is a nice place to camp for the night. Looking back at the same three peaks, the next shot is the same scene at sunset. The next year we went up to the Canadian Rockies and we visited Lake O'Hara. The prized peak in there is Hungabi. An Indian word means the chieftain. My father found a Swiss guide he'd climbed with previously, and we went up Hungabi pretty much by the right-hand ridge. A close-up of Hungabi, pretty much we went up the right-hand ridge to what looks like the top, but actually the summit is behind with an interesting ridge in between. Ringrose on the left and Hungabi on the right shows the right-hand ridge we went up to what looked like the summit, but you can see where the actual summit is in this slide. On the ridge of Hungabi near the top, there was a gap in the ridge in front of my father who took the picture. There was one long step across, and there really wasn't very much underneath. That left-hand side goes down at that same angle, 4,000 feet to the Paradise Glacier, and the other side nearly as steeply. Mount Schaefer is next to Hungabi. I've been up that at least 5 times. The glacier down below is the one we crossed on the way to Hungabi, and that's the first time I'd ever been on a glacier. On the other side of Mount Schaefer is Lake MacArthur. This was taken in midsummer, but some of the winter ice is still in the lake. The Alpine Club of Canada has a number of these cabins or huts in the mountains. This is at Lake O'Hara with Mount Huber in the background. The Alpine Club has a summer camp each summer. This was in 1973 at Glacier Lake in Alberta. It was about a 15-mile hike in, served by pack train. You see the pack horse on the right. That's the dining tent. That's always a popular center. This is where a new girl wondered why she heard so much thunder. There weren't that many clouds. Of course, what she heard was the glacier. Above the same camp, these are the Lyell Peaks. Shows how much snow and ice is in that area. That's my husband Dave. We're climbing something in the foreground called Artemis. I've been up that twice. The Alpine Club camped in the Bugaboos in 1959. We climbed Marmalata in the center and Pigeon to the right. And notice the old miner's cabin. The old miner's cabin is still there with a new roof on it. In 2000, 25 of us from the Green Valley Hiking Club went in there on a helicopter hiking project. The high camp in the Bugaboos after it snowed one night. Now there's a new hut up there that holds at least 40 people. Sort of a different living conditions. Marmalata, which we climbed from that high camp. We went up this side. It's more difficult than it looks. We went down the back side. Coming down Marmalata, crossing the Bergschrund. The glacier moves down, pulls away from the mountain above and leaves a gap, which is the Bergschrund. In crossing these, it helps if you have a sense of balance. We took advantage of the snow bridge. Some of the other peaks in the Bugaboos. Pigeon is in the right, in the middle there, which we climb. Snow patch on the left, and the ridge going up the right is Bugaboo Spire. I met a rope going up there. This was a fun sort of climbing on the ridge going up Mount Chancellor. However, as you get older, not fun anymore. Climbing together on a rope like this, it's important to have harmony. The first two of us climbed happily together for years. The other two are a married couple. I don't know about their married life, but climbing together on a rope like this, they're absolutely incompatible. Also, you might wonder why we rope. Well, that's a glacier. Another day on this same glacier, a big heavy guy from Los Angeles suddenly dropped through into a hidden crevasse. We had the rope just right, no problem. But if we hadn't been roped, or if there'd been slack in the rope, it could have been a real mess. On the other hand, this glacier is bare ice. We could see where the crevasses are, so we didn't bother to rope here. But this one was a sea of crevasses. We had to pick our way quite carefully. You can see the second rope coming up to join us in the background. The top of Mount Silvertip in the northern Selkirk. So there's a certain satisfaction in reaching a top like this. Nice place for lunch, take pictures, enjoy the view, relax. I'm on the right. Next to me is my friend Gertrude Smith from Vancouver, a good friend from many years. Across from Silvertip is Mount Sir Sanford, the highest peak in the interior ranges of British Columbia. We were staying at a hut down at the bottom there, and we climbed Sir Sanford from there. This is the same scene with Gertrude in the foreground. We dropped down to the glacier, which you can't really see here, went around to the right. I need to point this out. And behind this peak, we had problems up at this point, and we thought we'd avoid that coming down. We'd rappel down to the right there, but that wasn't any better. The snow was such soft mush we couldn't get an anchor for a rappel rope. Our leader, Roger Neve, cutting steps to make it easier to get up there. Notice how he's burned absolutely black by the sun. That is not his natural color. The moral of this is wear a hat and use sunscreen. The top of Mount Sir Sanford, not the place for lunch, strictly one at a time. Coming back down the ridge on Mount Sir Sanford, sometimes these ridges are corniced. One has to be careful. I fell through a cornice years ago, and I have a healthy respect for them. But you don't want to get too far down to the right. It gets rather steep. Here we are climbing up the ridge on the Citadel. This is the Little Blackfriar, still in the northern Selkirks. We didn't climb the Little Blackfriar, but we're climbing the Big Blackfriar, which is in the foreground. Mount Edith Cavell, near Jasper in Alberta. My father made the second ascent of that in 1919, and three of us climbed it in 1956. We went up the left-hand ridge, over the top, and down the right. Just west of there is the Tonquin Valley. The Alpine Club camp was in there in 1977. Four of us started from the camp, which was behind this picture, went around the lake and climbed Clitheroe, the peak on the left. Another view of the Tonquin Valley with the ramparts. Another view of the Tonquin Valley with the ramparts. This is the same camp in the Tonquin, 1977, with Mount Geeky in the background. That was just too much. Nobody did get up Geeky that time. The waterfall and the ice fall and the caribous. The water was moving faster, but that ice was moving too. We could hear it thundering and rumbling at intervals during the night. Recently I was in there again, and that glacier receded quite a bit. Gertrude and I had bushwhacked and beat our way up here for several days. We had set up a camp near here. We climbed some mountains that nobody had ever climbed before. Mount Sir Donald is in the Selkirks. My mother named her dog for this peak and called him Don. The Alpine Club of Canada had a camp there in 1956. 5 of us left the camp at 2:30 in the morning, went up the left-hand ridge, over the top, and down the right-hand side. Another view of Mount Sir Donald. It shows the route better. We went up, starting down in the trees at the bottom, up the left-hand skyline, over the right. There was one bad overhang there. We had a rappel. It was about 100 feet overhanging, and it was like a spider going down a thread. And then we couldn't get down on the glacier, which had receded, leaving smooth cliff. So we had to climb up on that ridge to the right by that little sharp peak. Came clear around to the right. We made it back to camp in time for dinner, but we were the only group that did. Another group spent the night sitting up in here, and another group decided to go down the left-hand ridge, and they were thankful to spend the night on the level there at the skyline. This mushroom was beside the trail near Lake Louise. Some artist, or would-be artist, had decorated it. Mount Assiniboine is considered the Matterhorn of the Canadian Rockies. The Alpine Club camp was in there in 1952, but only 3 people got up the peak. Oh man, I went back there in 1958, and we did climb it up that center ridge. I was back there again in July 2002, and it looks just as fine as ever. This billy goat posed for us in Glacier Park, Montana. In the national parks, the animals are not hunted, and they're nice and tame. Some of the animals are so tame that some of them are so tame they come right inside the car. The Jungfrau in the Alps looks just fine at sunset. It did not look like that in 1966 when I went over with some Canadian friends, but we climbed it anyway in bad weather. We didn't see anything, but we did make the top. But one thing, we had it all to ourselves, which in the Alps in mid-season is rather unusual on a peak like that. The weather was so bad the guides wouldn't go up there. Nobody else did either. The Monk is next to the Jungfrau. I have climbed that twice, 2 different routes, 2 different years. And then we moved over to Zermatt, and here we are admiring the Matterhorn, surely one of the most beautiful mountains in the world. My friends were just itching to climb it. I had climbed it in 1948 with a Swiss guide, and it was so perfect it could never be the same again. I didn't want to do it again, so I climbed the Matterhorn that day instead, and then wondered where they were. They didn't come in the second night. A close-up of the Matterhorn shows the route going up the center there, up to the shoulder. The hardest part's near the top above the shoulder. My friends spent too much time on it. Night caught them, and they spent the night sitting on a ledge somewhere up there. And it snowed quite heavily during the night, and they found it difficult getting down the next day. This was a different view of the Matterhorn taken from the Gornergrad. My husband took this in October when there was quite a lot of snow on it. The Zeno Rothorn, I think, really is more difficult to climb than the Matterhorn. I was over there with my mother in 1957, and a Swiss guide and I spent the night at a hut just below this picture. We went up that left-hand ridge, came back and spent a second night at the same hut. The next day, the guide and I traversed these 2 from right to left, the Wellenkuppe on the right with a big cornice, and the Obergabelhorn, came down on the left-hand side of the Obergabelhorn, back to Zermatt in time for dinner. The peak in the foreground is the Untergabelhorn. I climbed that at a different time. The Breithorn is the easiest to climb of the 4,000-meter peaks at Zermatt. The weather was not very good. In due time, 3 of us reached the top. It was fine up here with a view of the Matterhorn in the center, the Dent Blanche to the right, but very soon we had to go back down to all that soup. The scarf effect is because of a really severe sunburn. Monte Rosa is the highest peak in Switzerland. It's 15,200 and some. Zermatt is 5,300, so it's almost 10,000 feet above the town. I spent the night at a hut down at the right-hand corner. I don't think you can see it. And we left there about 2:30 in the morning and climbed the peak. We like to start early when the snow is frozen hard. There are a lot of crevasses in there, and there's a definite crevasse danger, so it's better to climb early when the snow is frozen hard before the sun gets on it. And then we moved over to the French Alps at Chamonix, and we're spending the day going up to do a difficult climb the next day from a hut. That's Gertrude on the left, Wally Joyce from Toronto in the middle, and I'm on the right. That's the Aiguille Dreux on the right, on the left, excuse me, the Aiguille Verte and the Moine on the right. The hut where we spent the night is in the middle. There's a person on the snow way at the right-hand corner. And during the night, the weather collapsed. And in this case, I think it was providential that it did so, because I think we had bitten off more than we could chew. It would have been a very difficult climb. From the ice and snow of the Alps to something hot and dry, the Great Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt. It's almost 500 feet high, and it's an angle of 52 degrees. When I was there in 1960, they let you climb it as long as you went with a guide, although one had been killed on it the week before, which wasn't too reassuring. You can see two people climbing up there. And it's tricky because there's nothing to really get a grip on. Great view of Cairo from the top and the Nile Valley. Coming down is more tricky. If you lose your balance near the top, they scoop you up at the bottom. It's that steep. Coming back home to Arizona, Picacho Peak is on the interstate north of Tucson. This is where I first met the Green Valley Hiking Club. I was thinking of moving to Green Valley at the time, and I looked the group over rather carefully. As one of our leaders said later, in spite of that, you moved here anyway. When I was a new leader, I led a group of 35 up there, and I've climbed it various times. Mount Hood is the highest point in Oregon. It's the pride and joy of Portland. I climbed it in 1964 alone, although a friend was watching me with binoculars in case anything went wrong. Mount St. Helens was serene and beautiful in 1974 when we climbed it. In 1980, it exploded, blew the whole top off. Gannett Peak and the Wind River Range in Wyoming is the highest peak in Wyoming. The Colorado Mountain Club trip here was climbing it in 1970. The rock there is called the Gooseneck. This was where our leader, who was on the ski patrol at Winter Park, and all three of the men were past presidents of the Colorado Mountain Club. But anyway, he broke his leg badly about 5 o'clock at night, well above Chamberlin. And two of us spent the night there. The other two went for help. During the night, some people came up to help us. But by the following night, he was still above timberline. And a helicopter came in to our camp, found somebody that knew where he was, went up and picked him up and took him out and saved his life. It was a bad break, a bad spiral fracture. This is my husband Dave on top of Mount Princeton, looking very happy. He's happy to be there. This is Dave and I on top of Mount Eolus, one of the 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado. Another Colorado Mountain Club trip. This was in the Andes in Peru. We were hiking in 25 miles up to a camp at 14,000 feet. This pack train, unfortunately, is not ours. It's going up to a mine. And our pack train didn't show up. We were told we each had to carry 35 pounds, which was easier for some people than others. This was our camp at 14,000 feet. It was a 3-week camp. At the start, there were 40 people in there. At the end of the camp, there were only 12 of us left, one other woman, Janet Johnson, so I kind of teamed up with her. It was hard living up here. It was cold. The first day there, a few of us walked up to this lake just to get the view. The next day, a few of us made a first ascent of this 17,000-foot peak called Chaco. You could see some people up near the top there. That was not the place for lunch, but this is, so we were having lunch here. This might not have been a first ascent because the Incas did amazing things, but in modern times it had not been climbed, at least. Next, we went up on the Continental Divide, which is very far west in South America. Most of the continent drains east into the Amazon. The gal in red there is Janet Johnson, the one who I mentioned before. Later, she went down to climb Aconcagua, the highest peak in the Americas. The weather was bad at the highest hut, and they said, "You better wait." She said, "I'm going on if it kills me." They didn't find her for about 3 years. The peak on the right is Takirahu. It's almost 20,000 feet. So our next objective was to try to climb that. This was starting out for the climb of Takirahu. In crossing bridges like this is another place where it helps if you have a sense of balance. This was the high camp on Takirahu where we spent 2 nights. There were 8 of us. One was a nice young lawyer from Denver named Dick Lamb. Later he was the governor of Colorado. From that camp you'd think we'd be able to make the top the next day, but we ran into various problems. This snow seemed rather treacherous. It took us a while to get up there. Roger Neef going up. On the right, you can see the top of Takirahu. The first rope is over there under this big crevasse with tremendous overhangs, just to the right of Roger. It took us a while to get across that crevasse. We got up within 200 feet of the top. A girl on the rope that I was on was sick, and she couldn't go on, and we wouldn't leave her, so we turned back. Probably good we did, because before we got back to that camp on the glacier, it was pitch dark. The first rope made it. Next, 4 of us climbed back up over the Continental Divide again to climb this peak, which is on the eastern slope on the Amazon side. We dropped down 1,000 feet to the east, climbed up that Dogleg Glacier. They let me lead that last ridge up to the top. This was a really nice first ascent of a 17,000-foot peak. This was the top of the peak. A large condor circled around just above us when we were up there. It gave you a funny feeling, the way a rabbit must feel when there's a hawk overhead. There's no way he could pick us up, but still, it's an odd sensation. The town of Yungay, underneath Mount Huascarán, the highest peak in Peru. When we were there in 1963, an avalanche had come down from the North Peak, which you can barely see, and it had buried part of the town and quite a few people. Since then, another one came down and it buried this entire town except the tops of some of the tallest palm trees, and many people were killed. It looks harmless, but actually it's deadly. Popo is one of 2 17,000-foot volcanoes close to Mexico City. Coming back from Peru, 3 of us, including Janet Johnson, and I stopped off at Mexico City. Ixtaccíhuatl is next to Popo, means the sleeping lady. The head on the left, the breast, the knees, and the feet are pretty much in the clouds. Don, one of the 3 of us, had climbed with a guide there previously, and he found this guide again, and we climbed Ixti with him. It was off-season, the weather wasn't good, but we had it all to ourselves. In 1967, Canada went all out to celebrate its centennial. Part of the celebration was this camp in the Yukon in the St. Elias Range. It was a 4-week camp, 2 periods of 2 weeks each. Mount Steele on the left there in the background is 16,625 feet high, and the Steele Glacier in the middle there was on the rampage. The year before they said it was moving 50 feet a day, which is extraordinary for a glacier. When we were there, we thought maybe we'd sit in the camp and watch the glacier go by, but actually it wasn't moving that fast. You can see part of the camp there to the right. To get here, we were taken on a bus from Whitehorse, 100 miles up the Alaska Highway, then taken in the back of a dump truck up an old mining road to the end, flown in by helicopter, and then we walked the last 5 miles. So it was somewhat inaccessible. I was in this tent with 3 other girls. The camps were divided into the men's section, the ladies' section, the married quarters section. And we thought we were pretty close to that glacier. If it's moving 50 feet a day, we might get engulfed, but it didn't. In the background is Teapot, and to climb that, we couldn't cross the glacier. It's too rough, so they flew us over by helicopter, 2 at a time. Then we climbed the peak and flew you back in time for dinner. It was a nice arrangement. Some of us went up on the glacier just to see what it was like. It was quite treacherous. We used a rope. This gives an idea of the Steele Glacier. It was 2 miles wide at this point. You can see the camp in the foreground. Here we are setting out for high camp. This was our high camp with Peak 5 in the background. Since then it's been named, but it was a nice first ascent, the camp in the foreground. The first day the weather was bad. The second day we crossed over the snow in the foreground, dropped down quite a ways to the glacier, and then went up around to the right. This was on the climb of Peak 5. It gives an idea of how much ice and snow is in that area. This sort of thing slowed us down a bit. This was another scene on Peak 5. This is another shot on Peak 5. Getting back to the camp there, we'd hoped to spend a second night, but some other people would come up and occupy the camp. We had to go clear back to the main camp. It was a 19-and-a-half-hour day, and we didn't sit around much. This was a nice first ascent of Peak 0 with Peak -1 in the background. You can see the second rope coming up. The peaks were numbered, starting with number 1 at the camp. These were down the valley below the camp, so that's why it's 0 and -1. At the end of the first camp, Mount Steele had not been climbed. They wanted to get someone up Mount Steele. The weather had been bad and people had tried it, flying up by helicopter. But at the second camp, the weather got a little better. I stayed over in the second camp and I got an opportunity to climb it. Flying up by helicopter, we couldn't walk up the glacier. It was too rough, so they flew us up to a high camp, and then we were to climb the peak from there. We left the camp at midnight. It was terribly cold, but we did reach the top. We got back to the camp about 6 o'clock at night when a fearful Arctic storm broke, and we were pinned down in 2 little pup tents for 48 hours. After 48 hours, the storm broke, and up came the helicopters. What a relief. There's no way we could have got out of there except by helicopter. And this is a picture looking back down the glacier. The camp was down in that upper right-hand corner beyond Peak 10, which we also climbed for the first time. The Arctic poppies were blooming. It seemed like early spring when we arrived in the camp. I was in there less than 4 weeks, and before I left, these were the autumn colors. Summer had come and gone in the Yukon in less than a month. The Indian paintbrush grows in the Yukon, also in North Carolina, and through the west, most places in between in the mountains. Very pretty. The moss campion is common in mountains. In 1967, a Colorado Mountain Club trip to New Zealand. We started out by climbing the 2 highest peaks on the North Island. The one that's in the background there is Narahoe, and in the foreground is Ruapehu. The crater on Ruapehu, about 30 of us had lunch at this point. They said the water in there was quite warm, nice for swimming, except there's some sort of acid in the water which would dissolve your bathing suit. Nobody tried it. Most people stayed at the lunch spot, but a few of us wanted to go up to the top. This is my husband Dave going up to the top. He regretted wearing those shorts. He got a surprisingly painful sunburn. Coming down from the top of Ruapehu, the Franz Josef Glacier on the South Island. We reached this on a bus. This is a drive-in glacier. The glaciers come down very low. Some of the Colorado people had never been on a glacier, so here we are going up on the glacier just to see what it's like. Mount Cook is the highest peak in New Zealand. It's quite a beautiful mountain. The Ball Hut where we stayed for climbing. Since then, an avalanche has come down from the left and carried away the greater part of the hut. Some people didn't like the Ball Hut. They moved down to the Hermitage, nice resort down below. But if you wanted to climb anything, you stayed at the hut. This is a view of Mount Cook taken from above the Ball Hut. The top of Mount Turner, which is a shoulder of Mount Cook, cold and windy. This is the view of Mount Cook taken from the top of Mount Turner. A few of us wanted to climb Mount Cook, and this is where we went up. We spent a whole day going up to the plateau hut. We used a rope too. It was that steep. This is on the same height going up to the plateau hut, a little higher up. It snowed a foot that night, and there's no way we could climb Mount Cook in all that fresh snow. So we had to wait a while for the avalanche danger to subside, and then we went back down to the Ball Hut. This is the Mitre at the end of the Milford Track. We hiked the Milford Track. It's considered one of the most beautiful hikes in the world. We didn't climb the Mitre, we just admired it. Mount McKinley, or Denali, is the highest peak in North America. The South Peak on the left is 20,320 feet high. The North Peak is 19,000 something. The base is around 3,000 feet, so it's one of the highest rises in the world. Also, it's in the Arctic. Most of the high mountains of the world are closer to the equator, which affects the climate. There were 7 of us. one of whom was Bob Lamphere, who climbed the peak. We all made it. He lives in Green Valley. The base camp on Mount McKinley in typical weather. I went up there in 1962. I was the third woman to make it up the peak, first by way of the West Buttress. This was typical weather. This is how it was climbing. We usually use the snowshoes lower down. Higher up we use the crampons. That's a food tin on top of my back there. I'm on the right. The fellow on the left is Lute Jerstad. He's one of the Americans that reached the top of Mount Everest the following year, and that's the first time that Americans had climbed Everest. Our camp at 13,000 feet on Windy Corner. It was very cold. It was below zero inside the tents at night. I was cold. My sleeping bag was not adequate. And freezing at night, carrying all that stuff during the day. I was about ready to quit, but there's no way you could quit. We had it all to ourselves. Nowadays, of course, they have people up there. There's nobody else up there when we were there. This is the West Buttress above us. We went around the right where there was some huge crevasses. The best part of this camp was it's on the rocks. There's no crevasse danger right there. This is the highest picture I have from Mount McKinley. That is the North Peak, and it's below us. I don't have one from the top, but you can see the clouds. We were in the clouds practically the whole time. Only once could we see down to the bottom. Mount McKinley really looks much better from a distance. This is a recent picture of me and my dog Molly in Madeira Canyon near Green Valley. I'm still hiking, leading hikes with the Green Valley Hiking Club, and I was up in the Canadian Rockies recently.